Hello and welcome to this video about events in wxWidgets. Events are generated when the user clicks on a button, presses a key, or resizes the window, just to name a few examples. We can detect these events and respond to them by executing some code. There are actually two different ways to handle events. This video covers static event handling. Let's get started. Here is the code from last time. I will get rid of all the controls except for the panel. We also don't need the spin control header. Okay, up to this point we have always used wxIdAny to give our controls arbitrary IDs. This time we need some custom IDs which we can store in an enum. When we define a custom ID, there are some rules we must follow. The ID must be positive, it cannot be 0 or 1, and it cannot be in the range from wxId lowest to wxId highest. In a second we will add a button, so let's create a button ID with value 2. Down here in the constructor, we will add a button with this ID. I will also call createStatusBar, which is a method inherited from wxFrame. Here is what our application looks like. We have the button, of course, and this status bar down here where we can display some text. When I click on the button, it emits an event. But how can we detect it and respond? The first step is to create an event handler. So let's navigate to mainframe.h. An event handler is simply a method which is called as a response to an event. We will declare a private method called onButtonClicked. The name of the method is not important. You can call it whatever you want. But it must take one parameter, which is a wx command event reference. It contains some information about the event. The next step is to implement our event handler. When the button is clicked, we will simply display some text in the status bar using wxLogStatus. Let's start the application again and see what happens when I click on the button. Well, nothing. We have to bind our event handler to the button's event first. We will do that using what's called an event table. In the header file, we must invoke a macro called wxDeclareEventTable. We define the event table in the implementation file. Here is how it works. We start with a call to wxBeginEventTable. It takes two parameters: the class we are defining the event table for and its base class. In our case, we are defining the event table for mainframe, which is a subclass of wxFrame. Now we can bind onButtonClicked to the button's event. To do that, we use evtButton. It needs to know the ID of the button and the event handler. Finally, we end the event table with wxEndEventTable. Does it work? Yes, it does. The status bar now says button clicked. Note that the event table only knows about the ID of the button. It doesn't even know that the button itself exists. Let's add 2 more controls and handle some events for them as well. I want to add a slider and a text control, so let's create 2 new IDs. And add the controls to the window. Next, we have to declare 2 more event handlers in the header file. We will detect when the slider changes value, and when the text in the text control changes. As you can probably tell, most events require event handlers which take a wx command event as parameter. But size events, which we will see soon, use wx size event, and more complicated controls emit events which use more specific event classes. You can always check wxWidgets documentation to see which events a control emits and how the event handlers should look. Alright, the next step is to implement the event handlers. First up is onSliderChanged. When the slider's value changes, I want to display some text followed by the new value. We can create a formatted string using wxStrings format method. I want the text to be slider value followed by an integer. The integer should of course be the slider's new value, which we can get from the command event. We will display this string in the status bar. We also need to implement onTextChanged. Here I will also create a formatted string. It should say text, followed by the content of the text control, which we get from the command event. Just like before, we will display it in the status bar. Now we just have to extend the event table. For the slider, we must use the EVT slider macro. This will call our event handler when the slider value changes. For the text control, we use EVT_text. This macro will make sure that our event handler is called whenever the text in the text control changes. Let's check it out. If I change the slider's value, we can see it in the status bar. If I change the text, we can also see that. And of course, our button event handler still works. I hope you have enjoyed this little demo of how to detect and respond to events using a static event table. In the next video, you will see how dynamic event handling works. It is actually both simpler and more powerful than the static way. See you next time.